Hey guys, it's Kiera, and in this lesson we'll be talking about all things color that a logo designer should know. So let's start off with RGB and CMYK. So RGB signifies that it's a color mode used for the web, and CMYK signifies that it's a color mode that's going to be used for print. And whenever you open up Illustrator and you create a new document, you get to choose between these two color modes. And it's important to actually choose between the right color mode because it signifies how this graphic you're going to be creating is going to be used in the future. So RGB, for example, is pretty much exclusively used for the web. And the colors that you can use for the web are a bit different than you can actually print out. So if you have a neon green in Illustrator with the RGB color mode, you can actually use that neon green on a website and you can actually replicate it one-to-one. But if you decide to print out that neon green with inks on a printer, then you wouldn't be able to get that full saturation and the color would be dulled down. And in this case, you'd actually have to be designing with CMYK. Because if you're not designing with CMYK in this case, if you're creating a logo with RGB and you select all these colors and you send it off to the client, they love it, they put it on their website, and then they take that same logo with RGB and they send it off to a printer for business cards, they're going to get much different values. And they're going to get those reds that are much more toned down, darker blues, and the colors just won't be the same. And if you're working for a brand, you're trying to make sure that this logo is as consistent as possible, which is why we're going to be creating style guides even in the future to make sure that the typeface looks the exact same on different sizes, because we're trying to get that consistency in that entire brand. So if you're designing a logo, you have to consider how this logo is going to be printed, if it's going to be printed, or even if it's only going to be used for the web, and choose the appropriate color space for it. That way you don't have those conversions, because during each conversion, Illustrator just guesses which color is the closest, and you're never going to get that exact same color match. So the less conversions, the more accurate our logo colors are going to be. And on the topic of these colors, it's also called gamut. That's the term for the actual range of colors that we can get through each color mode, or the actual scope. So on an RGB, you can get those really saturated colors, but on CMYK, those colors are limited. And we actually have a graph for that. It's these three. So the eye symbolizes the actual visible spectrum. So it shows the colors that we can actually perceive. The RGB shows the colors that we can actually show on web, anything that's really created through those three colors, usually anything with pixels or LEDs, etc. And CMYK is an even smaller portion of that RGB, and those are the colors that inks can actually reproduce. And it's interesting to note that RGB to CMYK, you'll actually see those colors being dulled down. But if you go from CMYK to RGB, then it's pretty much going to be the same colors, just expressed differently. And that's because those values overlap, and there's not going to be much difference. So now let's actually expand upon the topic of conversions. So like we said before, if we go from RGB to CMYK, we're actually going to drop some of those saturations. But if we go from CMYK back to RGB, we're not going to see any differences. And that's important to note, because once you go from one to the other, it's more like a linear approach. You can't exactly go back in time and retrieve your saturations. So let's actually go to Illustrator and quickly demo this idea. So in Illustrator, I'm going to create File, New, and I'm going to create a new document. It's going to be in the RGB color space, and I'm just going to call it Logo Core. I think the sizes are fine, and click OK. So now let's just create some few colors, just so we can actually see if there will be any changes when we go from RGB to CMYK. I'm going to get a purple. Let's make this a green. Let's make this a really contrasty blue. And the last one, let's see if we can get a really neon red. Perfect. Let's just align them for the sake of alignment, and we're going to remove the strokes off them. Perfect. So right now if we go to File, Document Color Mode, we see that we're in the RGB color space. But now we actually want to go back to CMYK color space because we're preparing this file for print. So we can click Color. And we see that some of the colors actually lost some of their saturation. Barely noticeable, but it still happened, and we have to keep this in mind. But now that let's say that we just lost those saturations in the color and we want to go back to RGB to retrieve them. If we go to File and click RGB color, you'll see that the colors stay the same just because there's no more conversions to be made. Those gamuts are overlapping, so you won't really see a stark difference in color. So on the topic of conversions, there's actually one more color space that's often used for logos. And that's because the logos usually don't require 15 different colors, but can usually be limited to 2 or 1. And this color system is called Pantone. It's a system for matching colors used in specifying printing inks. And Pantones are usually called spot colors. And CMYK is called process colors. So on the gamut of Pantone, it's located in between CMYK and RGB. They have a slightly higher scope than the CMYK. And it proves that Pantone can be sometimes especially useful for logo designs. So on the first advantage of Pantone, it's much more accurate than actually using CMYK. Because with CMYK, when you're actually printing these colors, it's just overlapping those 4 colors over and over each other until it gets as close as possible to the specified color. Meanwhile, Pantone doesn't really overlap colors in a print. It's more like an ink base, so it's already pre-made before it actually starts laying out the actual shape of it. Because with Pantone, it's more like a recipe. Once this recipe is created, it can be used pretty much anywhere, and the consistency is 100% accurate, because that recipe is never going to change. With CMYK, that recipe might sometimes change, just because there's always going to be those inaccuracy, just because you're overlaying colors on top of each other, and there sometimes might get skewed in values, and it's a bit harder to predict. Pantone colors are much more effective as well, because it's called 2-color printing. Because with Pantone, you don't have to have these 4 colors like you do in CMYK overlap each other until you get a certain color. With Pantone, if you only have 1 color, and you're only printing 1 color, it ends up being much, much cheaper. And with the Pantone matching system, it allows you actually to predict the results of whatever you're going to be printing. Because you actually get these physical books that you can actually look through all these colors, and it actually shows you how that color is going to be printed on specific paper. So Pantone 6674 green is going to be printed like this, uncoded, and like this, on uncoded. You can actually see it in front of you. You don't actually have to predict how the CMYK is going to come out, if it's going to lose contrast, or how it's going to look on this specific paper. You can actually see it in front of you. And that's a huge advantage when it comes to printing something. And we can actually see it in this diagram, how with CMYK, you actually have these little 4 dots just overlapping each other consistently to create a color. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, you just have this ink, and it just prints out that logo consistently. And no matter where you are, as long as you're using that spot color, it's always going to come out looking the exact same. But there's a slight drawback in the way Pantone works. Because, like I said before, whenever you convert colors in Illustrator, there's a chance of it being inaccurate. And with Pantone, we're actually trying to eliminate all these inaccuracies. But if we're converting to a Pantone spot color, then it's 100% that we're going to run into some type of inaccuracy. So if you're going with CMYK, and you start converting to Pantone, that Pantone color might not match up exactly with that CMYK because the Illustrator just simulating what kind of Pantone color would look as close as possible to that CMYK value that you're supplying to it. So it's an inconsistency. But if you have an actual Pantone color book in front of you, it will usually say, in the bridge books at least, how you can convert that Pantone color to CMYK. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the Pantone color in its spot color process, where it's printed using Pantone. And on the right-hand side, you actually see the CMYK conversion. And that's the conversion that's as close as you can get to that specific spot color. And that's pretty much the process you should be using if you decide to go the Pantone route. Pantone's just simulating the color in Illustrator. You're not going to be exactly sure how that color is going to come out on coated paper or uncoated paper. And that's pretty much the advantage of having an actual physical copy of a Pantone Bridge uncoated guide or solid uncoated or coated guide in front of you, so you can actually see the final result before you actually start designing the result. Hopefully that makes sense. So if you're just designing a logo, it's perfectly fine just to go with CMYK and just supply the client with that type of file. But if the client is going to be printing out thousands of these logos across millions of different platforms, then it's also helpful to supply a Pantone color in addition to the CMYK and RGB, just because it can sometimes end up being more cheaper for the client, and it can be more accurate for you to actually get the same color system going throughout their entire brand. But if you do go through that process, I do recommend you actually get a Pantone book in front of you before you start deciding on the actual colors that you're going to be using in your logo. So let's get into Illustrator, and I'll demo a few conversions that we can do inside of Illustrator. Now let's talk about the practicality of actually using that theory that we just learned in Illustrator. So like we did before, we can create any color in the fill menu, and let's just create a pink color. But we can't actually create a color palette this way, because if we create a new fill color, it's just going to forget about the previous color that we had. In this case, we're going to use swatches to actually remember the color that we chose and store it for later. In this case, you can go to the window, open up the swatches menu. It's going to open up with something like this, and we can hit the drop down and we can do new swatch, and the swatch that we have in our fill or even the stroke, it's going to just add it into our swatches. And in this case, we are in the CMYK color mode. It's a process color, and all these values look pretty much like what we need. We're going to click OK, and it's added to our swatch menu. But in this case, we don't just want to add it to a swatch menu, which is just a color group that we don't really have much control over. We want to create our own personal color swatches that we can actually apply to this logo later. So in this case, I need to create a color group. And same menu, just new color group. We're going to call it Logo Core Experiment. And that color is going to be added to our color group. Now I'm going to create a new color. I'm going to make it a unsaturated blue. I'm going to do the exact same thing, new swatch. I'm going to drag it into my color group. And I'm going to make one more. So let's go from blue and let's just choose a darker orange. Same idea, and add it to a new swatch. Drag it into our color group, and there's that. That's the manual way of creating a color palette. But oftentimes, I'm not that great with actually choosing these colors, to be completely honest. So I usually sample other people's color schemes so I can actually sample and filter through what looks good and what doesn't look good for a particular logo that I would be working on. So in this case, Adobe actually has a great app called Kuler, where you can actually sample other people's color schemes and just apply it to your own logo. So we're going to open it up just by typing Adobe Kuler into Google, and it'll be the first result. We can go to Explore, and there's a bunch of colors for us right here to use. So I'm going to go to Most Popular, and I'm just going to grab something from this month. And let's see, what would look good on a dragonish logo? So I'm going to look through. And we can always add as many colors as we want to our palettes. But in this case, I don't really see anything I like. So I'm going to go to Most Used for this month. And I think this would look good. So I can click on Info, Save to Library. I can click Dragon, save it. It's going to save it to our Illustrator. We can go back to our Illustrator, and we just have to open it up now. So we can go to Window, Color Themes, and here it is. We just have to refresh Kuler. It's going down to our color themes, and here it is. So then in this case, we can actually take these color groups, and every time we click this folder, it's just going to get added into our swatches. So I like this one and Logo Core Sunny. So I'm going to add these two. And we just created more groups in our color palette to experiment with. And now here's a fun part. We can actually edit these colors on the fly within Illustrator. So the slow way of approaching color changes on a logo is to actually do the indirect selection tool, select the orange, let's say, then go to Select, Same, Fill Color. It's going to select all the orange parts of the logo. We can change the orange to, let's say, a darker red. We can't actually preview it at this time. We have to click OK. We see the color change. We can go yes, no. Otherwise, we have to go back, and we have to do that process over and over and over again. And you can kind of see how that would take a very long time to do. So there's actually a way to go around this. We can select this logo and we can go to Edit, Edit Colors, and Recolor Artwork. And let's just go over these options really quick. So I'm just going to drag this to the side. So here we actually have all the colors that are used in this logo. And here we can actually choose the colors that we want it to be converted to. So in this case, we can actually choose a color. And we can actually dim it if we want. And we can see it happening live. So we can dim the colors on this. Make it maybe more saturated. And we can play with it live. We can also just import a color palette and just apply a default color palette that we currently have and pretty much just apply it to a new color palette. So we're just overlapping the colors to the ones that we want to play around with. So in this case, let's just do the copy of Firenze. That's a color scheme that we have. I click it and it automatically just imports the color schemes onto our current logo. And you can see that we already created a really cool combination and we didn't even have to play around with the colors for that long. But in this case, I don't really like the green being on the wings, so I can actually click the color and just drag it down. And I'm going to replace it with the yellow. And we just switch the color palettes. And we can do this over and over again until we find a combination that we like. So I don't actually like the green, so I'm going to click on the green and I'm just going to hue it all the way to the yellows. And that looks pretty cool. And we did that within seconds. We don't even have to like import colors or like go back and forth. We can do this like we see the color changes happening live on our screen. And it's a tremendous time saver. We can even go into the edit menu and just play around with these values. So we can see that the entire logo can shift hues if we push this entire thing to the left. One of these singular little dots and just pull them in or out to change the actual saturation of the color. And again, it's all happening live. It's incredible to see how fast we can change these colors. And we can create multiple iterations of this because it's not just applying this color change to the entire document, but only for the things that you select before going into edit color menu, which is what we're in right now, the recolor artwork. We can go back to assign and we're happy with that. We're going to click OK. Save changes to our group color, yes, because we did change that one color. And there we go. Our colors have changed. But now let's actually revisit some of the theory that we had before, because now we want to see if we can convert this logo to a Pantone color. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to drag it over to the side. I'm going to select both and just drag them to the center. It's actually just misaligned. I'm just going to put this down just a bit. Perfect. And now let's see if we can actually convert this logo to Pantone without losing too much color, or even see how the change would look like. So I'm going to select everything, go to Edit, Edit Color, Recolor Artwork. But now we're not going to be importing any color schemes. This time we're just going to be converting it to a color book. But we're just going to limit that color to a specific gamut, which we talked about before, that specific color range that we have. So I'm going to click on this little icon, go to Color Books, and in this case, I'm going to choose Solid Uncoated. The difference between coated and uncoated is just the paper that it's printed on. And in this case, I'm assuming it would be a letterhead, not like a finished business card with a gloss on it, just a regular paper, which is uncoated. I'm going to click that. It's going to automatically input the proper Pantones, and we're going to click OK. And in this case, we didn't actually lose too much color. We do see that the orange on the actual shininess kind of lost its saturation, but nothing too much. So we can actually use these Pantones and just reapply them to CMYKs because, again, not too much of a loss of color, and I actually like how it's turning out. But we can actually click on one of these colors. We can go to the color menu, and with it we see the actual Pantone that we selected. In this case, 1815 uncoated. But again, Illustrator is simulating this, so we're not actually sure how it would turn out when it's actually printed on coated paper. But we do see that we can convert these colors to Pantone fairly easily. And we can do the exact same thing for these colors. We just have to select them, edit colors, recolor artwork. We're going to choose a color book, solid uncoated. It has a conflict, so we're just going to do a apply to all merge swatches, click OK, and it again converted the colors to Pantone for us. And then if we want to go from Pantone to CMYK, we're just going to click on this little icon that just converts it to CMYK. And then we can grab the values from here. And looks pretty much identical. So that's pretty much all you really need to know when it comes to colors within Illustrator. You can always create a new swatch manually, import a huge color palette into Illustrator to save time, and then you can just edit colors through the Recolor Artwork menu. And that's pretty much the entire process when you're actually choosing colors for these different logos. All you have to make sure is that in the beginning, you know what kind of color space you're designing in. If it's RGB, try to design an RGB to avoid conflicts to later turning everything into CMYK. But if you're doing CMYK, just keep it in CMYK. Don't expect to convert to RGB later and suddenly gain much more contrast in your logos. Especially if you're doing t-shirt designs or any other type of artwork, just make sure you plan ahead just so you don't have to do any more useless conversions. Because again, every time you convert, those colors are going to slightly change in the way they're presented. So the less conversions, the more accurate that color is going to become. So I'll see you in the next lesson.